Hello dear students, myself Dr. Sachin Gurule, Assistant Professor from Department of Zoology, KTHM College, Nasik. In the previous lecture of SYBSc of subject Animal Diversity 3rd, we have learned the respiratory system of the scoliodon, that is the Indian shark. And in this lecture, we are going to learn the external and internal structure of heart, which is the part of circulatory system. So let's see the external structure of the heart of scoliodon. Now the heart of scoliodon is reddish brown in color. It is conical and that heart lies mid-ventrally beneath the pharynx in the head region. So the heart of the scoliodon, it is located at the mid-ventral region in the head part of their body. Now this heart is a simple dorsoventrally bent S-shaped muscular tube and it lies in a cavity. That cavity is known as pericardial cavity. This pericardial cavity bounded by the two-layered membranous pericardium. So this pericardium is there and that pericardium is encloses a cavity which is referred as the pericardial cavity in which the heart is located. Now it is a median triangular cavity lying between the gills with the apex directed forwards and is almost completely occupied by the heart only. So complete portion of this pericardial cavity is enclosed by that heart of scoliodon. Now the heart of scoliodon contains only deoxygenated blood. Hence, it is also called as the venous heart or the branchial heart because the pump is this heart is receiving the deoxygenated or one can say used blood from the various body parts and it pumps that deoxygenated blood into the gills for its oxygenation and hence whatever blood which come into the heart of that scoliodon, it is the deoxygenated one and it is pumped towards the gill for the oxygenation, means the blood contains the deoxygenated type of blood, hence it is referred as venous or is referred as a branchial heart. Branchial heart because it pumps the blood towards a branchial, that is gills region. So this is the introduction. Now heart of the scoliodon is four chambered. Again the four chambered heart is a characteristic feature of the contractile species and it contains a chamber which are namely sinus venosus, then atrium. Atrium is also known as the auricle, then the ventricle which is the third compartment or the third chamber, and the fourth one is conus arteriosus. So in this way there are total four chambers. We can say the two major chambers and two accessory chamber. Accessory chamber include the sinus venosus and the conus arteriosus. So let's see one by one. First of all, the sinus venosus. Now this sinus venosus is somewhat triangular. See here in this diagram you can see it is somewhat a triangular shaped chamber. It is thin walled and the posterior most chamber. So if you see this pericardial cavity which contains the heart, the chamber known as a sinus venosus which is located at the posterior most part of the heart and this extended transversely and lying at the base of pericardial cavity. So here you can see, so this is a pericardium and that pericardium enclosing a cavity which is known as a pericardial cavity, and towards the pericardial cavity at the posterior end you can able to found the first chamber of the heart which is known as the sinus venosus. Now this sinus venosus is fused with that of the pericardium. So here in this diagram you can easily see, or in this LS also, so our sagittal section you can see the walls of the sinus venosus is get fused or get attached with that of the pericardium. Now laterally this sinus venosus receives a two large veins. So here this one is the first vein and this one is the second vein. These veins are referred as ducti cuveri, or they are also referred as equivarian ducts. So these are the major two large veins opens into the first chamber, that is sinus venosus. Now this each duct, one on each side, one from the left side and one from the right side, while in addition to this cuvarian duct, it also receives the blood from a two small sinuses which is coming from the liver actually, and these are referred as the hepatic sinuses. Now this hepatic sinus opens into it in the posterior middle line. So this is a median area of the this sinus venosus where these hepatic sinuses are also open. Now this sinus venosus opens anteriorly into the atrium, so called as a auricle. So this is a auricle. So here in the sagittal section you can see the heart is somewhat S-shaped tube, and this is a posterior most part, that is sinus venosus, and this sinus venosus is opens into the auricle. So in this section ventral view you cannot able to completely expose towards the auricle. So this auricle is just beneath the this ventricle and the conus arteriosus, but in sagittal section you can see this blood from the sinus venosus is goes into the auricle. So sinus venosus opens into the atrium or the auricle by a aperture. Obviously this aperture is referred as sino-auricular aperture, and that aperture is always guarded by a pair of membranous wall, and that wall is referred as sino-auricular wall, or it is also referred as a sinoatrial wall. You can pronounce in either way. So these valves prevents a backflow of the blood back into the sinus venosus. So this is a valve which is responsible for preventing that backflow of the blood. Means blood once coming from the sinus venosus into the auricle, it never goes back into the sinus venosus due to the presence of these two valves. The sinoatrial valve are highly contractile one, and the beating of the heart, it originates from this heart. We can say this is the region which is referred as the pacemaker. Pacemaker is generally the region we can define where actually the rhythmic wave of contraction into the heart is start, which is not referred as the pacemaker. So here in case of the heart of scoliodon, this sinoatrial valve, it is the region from which the wave of contraction into the heart is begins. So this is about the first chamber known as the sinus venosus. Then second one is the auricle. Now auricle is a large triangular sac. So here you can see in the sagittal section is a large triangular sac lying in front of the sinus venosus. So this is the sinus venosus, and in front of that sinus venosus there is a atrium, or so called as the auricle. Now this auricle occupies the dorsal half of the pericardial cavity. So this is a pericardium, and it enclosing a cavity known as a pericardial cavity, and if you see this is the dorsal portion of the pericardial cavity, it is completely enclosed by this atrium, so called as the auricle. Now its walls are somewhat thicker than that of the sinus venosus. If you compare the walls in this sagittal section, you can easily see the walls of the sinus venosus are comparatively smaller than that of the walls of the auricle, particularly in their thickness. Now its lateral posterior angles are produced into the processes which projects laterally at the sides of the ventricle like that of the ears, and it opens into the ventricle through the aperture. Now this aperture is referred as auriculoventricular aperture because this aperture is present in between the auricle and ventricle. So this auriculoventricular aperture, this is also guarded by the bilabiate valve. This again, the function of that bilabiate valve is to prevent backward flow of the blood back from the ventricle to the auricle. Means again once this aperture is get open or the valve is open, whatever blood which is contained into the auricle, it enters into the ventricle, and once it is entered into the ventricle, it never comes back into the auricle, and that backflow is prevented by this bilabiate valve which is present between the auricle and ventricle, or the aperture is known as auriculoventricular aperture. So this is about the second chamber, that is known as the auricle. Now the third chamber of the heart of scoliodon is known as a ventricle, so which is the most prominent and pear-shaped chamber of the heart of a scoliodon. It has a very thick muscular wall. Again, if you see the thickness of the wall of the different chambers into the heart, you will find that the walls of the ventricle, they are the thickest one as compared with the walls of the other chamber. The inner surface of the ventricle is produced into the numerous muscular strand which gives it a spongy texture. So here you can see the spongy texture of that ventricle from the inner side. The opposite wall are held in place by the structure which is known as the chordae tendineae. So these are the chordae tendineae which is responsible for holding the opposite wall in their proper position. It also protects the ventricle to expand beyond its capacity. Means this chordae tendineae has the important role in the relaxation of the or the expansion of the ventricle also. Now it communicates dorsally with the auricle through the auriculoventricular aperture, and with the anterior side it communicates with the last chamber of the heart which is known as the conus arteriosus. So this is a conus arteriosus. So the blood once comes into the ventricle, it goes into the next chamber known as the conus arteriosus. So let's see first of all the conus arteriosus again. Now, conus arteriosus is a stout muscular tube. This one is a muscular tube which arises from the ventricle, and it extends up to the anterior end of the pericardial cavity. So this is the anterior end of pericardial cavity, and this one is a posterior end. At the posterior end there is a sinus venosus, and at the anterior end there is conus arteriosus. So its inner walls are provided with the two transverse rows of the semilunar wall. So here in this diagram you can see the semilunar wall, each row containing further three walls, one located at the dorsal and two are ventrolateral in their position. Now in addition to these, there is always a small accessory wall on either side of the dorsal wall. So the semilunar wall is well developed here, and which is lies in between the ventricle and the conus arteriosus. The walls of the anterior row, they are larger than that of the posterior row, and whatever free ends of the walls are there, these are always connected with the walls of the ventricle by a fine tendinous thread to keep a valve in their proper position. So these valves again prevent the backflow of the blood into the ventricle. Means again, once the blood from the ventricle it pumps into the this conus arteriosus, it is never came back into the ventricle. This is due to this pair of a semilunar valve. The conus arteriosus is continued forward through a wall of pericardium, and this tube is referred as a ventral aorta. So this ventral aorta is responsible for transporting the deoxygenated blood which is pumped by the heart towards the gill for their oxygenation. So this is about the external and the internal structure of the heart of the scoliodon. Then how it works. So let's see the working of the heart of scoliodon. As already mentioned, the heart of scoliodon is a venous type, since it receives only the venous or so called as deoxygenated blood from the various parts of the body via the two major veins and that opens directly into the sinus venosus. The blood also flows through the heart only once, hence, whatever circulation which is shown by the heart of the scoliodon is referred as a single circulation, means the blood is circulated only once through the heart, and such a kind of the circulation we call as the single circulation. The heart pumps the venous blood into the gill for the purpose of aeration, so called as the oxygenation. And for this purpose, the different chambers of the heart rhythmically contract at a regular interval in a definite sequence. The contraction of heart is called as the systole, while the relaxation of the heart is known as the diastole. And the blood flow of the heart, it occurs into the definite way, means the once blood coming from the different body parts into the sinus venosus, it always enters into the auricle, then it goes into the ventricle, from ventricle it enters into the conus arteriosus, and from conus arteriosus it enters into the ventral aorta, and via the ventral aorta by the afferent arteries it goes into the gills for the oxygenation. Now, the chambers of the heart of scoliodon, they are categorized into the receiving chamber and forwarding chamber. So there are two receiving chamber. The first receiving chamber is sinus venosus and second one is a auricle. While the forwarding chamber means the blood is flows towards the for their oxygenation by the two chamber, and that name of two chamber is ventricle and the conus arteriosus. So let's see how exactly the heart works. Now heartbeat obviously starts with the sinus venosus. We have seen the sino-auricular valve, which is acting as a pacemaker in case of the heart of scoliodon, from which the wave of rhythmic contraction is initiated and which is then subsequently spread on the sinus venosus by contracting the walls of sinus venosus. Once the contraction occurs, the blood is forced directly into the auricle through the aperture which is guarded by the valve which is known as the sino-auricular valve. And now after the complete contraction of sinus venosus, blood enters into the auricle. So this is a sinus venosus. In this diagram you cannot able to see the sinus venosus actually. So it receives the blood from the Cuvarian duct and the hepatic sinuses, and through which it enters directly into the auricle. Now once auricle receives the blood from the sinus venosus, this auricle goes under the contraction and forcing its blood into the ventricle through the aperture known as auriculoventricular aperture. Again, this aperture is also guarded by the valve, which is a bilabiate valve known as the auriculoventricular valve. Now, after that, the entry of blood into the ventricle. Now the wave of rhythmic contraction is goes or spreads over the ventricle, and then walls of the ventricle starts contracting, and once the ventricle is get contracted, blood forces into the next chamber that is known as the conus arteriosus, and here also the backflow of the blood is prevented by the bilabiate valve. Now these valves are referred as semilunar valve. So once the blood coming into the ventricle and when it is get contracted, it forces its bloods into the next chamber known as the conus arteriosus. Now from conus arteriosus, blood again passes into the forward direction towards a ventral aorta. So this is the ventral aorta which is located at the anterior most part of the pericardial cavity. Now once the blood from the conus arteriosus, it enters into the ventral aorta. These ventral aorta, they are provided with or they supplied with a different afferent branchial arteries, and these afferent branchial arteries, they pass the deoxygenated blood coming from the heart towards the gill for the purpose of oxygenation, and the walls of the heart are also supplied the oxygenated blood via the coronary artery. But this oxygenated blood is provided to the heart only after its oxygenation. So in this way, the heart of the scoliodon works. There are two receiving chamber, sinus venosus and the auricle, while remaining two, that is ventricle and the conus arteriosus, which are acting as the forwarding chamber. So this is about the working of heart, and in this lecture we have learned the external internal structure of the heart and the working of heart. So thank you very much.